Well, friends, welcome back to the Space for Faith podcast. I'm Mike Goldsworthy, and I am grateful that you would join us today. And I'm really excited to get to introduce you all. In fact, many of you probably already know her, but if you do not, she is a newer friend to me, Tiffany. Tiffany, and I realized, and I'm realizing this right now as I'm about to introduce you, that I don't know how to pronounce your last name, and I want to say it's Bloom, but I realized I could be saying it wrong. And you're nodding your head that I got it right. That makes me
You got it right. Bloom like a flower.
That makes me
Tiffany
feel really
like the
good.
diamonds.
I made a note to ask you that, and then we had like a lovely conversation before we started recording, and I lost it all. So Tiffany Bluhm coming to us hot from Seattle, the lovely Pacific Northwest right now. And Tiffany, we got to meet a few months ago at a little gathering out in New York, where some folks brought together some people who are doing good and liberative work in the world, and you and I ended up with a small group of us like hanging out, popping into like random like art places in New York, which was really fun. It was fun to get to hear some of your story and some of the work that you've done. So like, such a gift to have you here today.
Thanks for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
So I'm going to have you share a bit about yourself here, but here's what I've got from your official bio is that you're a speaker and a writer with more than 15 years experience in ministry and nonprofit leadership. You authored 3 previous books, and you are speaking and writing with organizations around the world, really. And then your bio ends this way, which was, for me, actually really helpful framing, that it says, as a minority immigrant woman with an interracial family, Bloom is passionate about inviting all to the table of faith, equality, justice, and dignity. I love that.
Yeah, we're the United Nations over here. Between my husband and my oldest son is Ugandan, my youngest son straight out the chute, and my husband's white. So we're quite the odd little looking family when we show up at the climbing gym. So it really is a passion, and I think that as a minority growing up in a predominantly white space, Mike, I did not meet another person of color until I was in middle school. Really, really passionate about the outsiders being the insiders and everyone finding their space at the table.
I love that. It's so beautiful. And did you say that your child came out the chute? Is that what we said?
That's how do you need me to explain how this works too? I feel like you have children already, but
I know,
it's okay if I do.
Oh, this
okay,
is
I actually
why
had
we're
a
friends
C-section. Mike, you're the actual best. When Mike says we spent some time together, he means like 48 solid hours
Yeah, it was
together. It was a lot. It was a lot. And we walked like 4 miles, but it wasn't humid, so it worked and it was great. And we played New Yorkers for a day. It was very cool.
Well, let me just ask before I start asking you some other questions. Did I miss anything that would be helpful in filling in the gaps for folks on who you are and what you're up to in the world?
Yeah, I am a former megachurch pastor.
Yeah.
Aren't we all? Joke. Just kidding there. And I am so passionate about specifically women finding their intersection of cultural identity, power, and liberation, because I think, and we're going to get really into it here in a minute, but there is some poor exegesis that is mainstream for women. And I think that there's a juicier, more holistic way to view our place in the gospel story and in Christendom at large.
I love that. That's a great little segue for us here. So originally when I wanted to have you on, you had written a book called Pray Tell. I'll link to it in the show notes that I wanted to chat with you about. And then I learned that you had this new one coming out, and I thought like it would be so great to talk to you about it. And then I get it, and it's a devotional. You wrote a devotional, which I'll be honest, when I first got it, kind of messed with me a little bit, that I was like, who's this new friend of mine who writes devotionals?
I have stretched the limits of what one might call a devotional.
Yeah. So, okay, tell us about that.
I had an idea to feature women in history. I'm such a history buff, specifically the women's movement, not only here in the U.S., but worldwide. And I wanted to find a way for my publisher to allow me to feature so many different ideas and stories. And I said, 12 chapters, I got to limit that down, but not if I read a devotional, because then it's 40 entries and then I can invite friends to contribute. So it really came out of this idea of bite-sized understanding of women's liberation for here and now, very much self-care for social change, not self-care in the $1 trillion bubble bath industry, but self-care as in seeing yourself as dignified and valuable in a world that isn't.
Oh my gosh. You are so good at saying so much in a compact and concise way, which works out well, apparently, for writing a devotional as well. Yeah. I mean, honestly, my experience with, and I obviously don't have extensive experience with women's devotionals, but I have some experience having been a former pastor and getting materials, reviewing materials, whatever. It very much fits in the live, laugh, love sort of space, a lot of it.
100%, it normally does.
Yeah. And then maybe it's your first chapter, your very first one, you do talk about self-care within that. And you're talking about Rahab to talk about self-care, which I feel like is radical and subversive there. So you already hit on it a little bit. I was going to read some of it, but I'd rather have you talk a little bit more about, rather than just reading what you wrote, tell me a little bit more about how are you re-understanding self-care, trying to reclaim self-care and what it means in a liberative framework for women.
Absolutely. If we zoom out for a second, you'll see that so much of our understanding of women in Scripture is identifying them first by their disadvantages. They were poor, they were from the other side of the tracks, they were young, they were unmarried. Everything is for the deficit. Whereas we are reading that into the text, and in reality, in their time and place, they were not identifying themselves by the deficit. They could see their value. When you look at women through history, when you look at women through biblical history, they saw their value and they invited the world to see them as a valuable participant in the story of God. And so that's what I've tried to do here, even looking at Rahab. Or, I think of flannel board Sunday school lessons growing up, and she was portrayed as this woman of the night who had just a dose of kindness to help the Israelite spies. But if I would have been told the real story, I could have found myself in it. I could have understand my own clumsiness, my own strength, my own weaknesses, my own deficiencies, and also my own goodness in a way that is nuanced and in the gray. So much of our life is gray. We're both good and bad at the same time. So being able to see ourselves in these stories and being able to see how this woman was the head of her household. She is in Israelite history as a formidable woman. She was able to prophetically speak over these spies what they couldn't realize for themselves. So just this understanding of how she was willing to commit treason to protect her family and to protect herself and to make sure her family be fed, that is badass. Being willing to stand up and step up for the goodness that no one else is about to hand you, so you hand it to yourself.
Dang. I don't.
We hardly glorify treason in Sunday school. So it's good to know the real story, and it's good to know the story from her perspective rather than this context we've placed upon her, stripping her of her dignity and her ability to take care of herself and her family that led to social change.
Okay. So tell me how you connect that to self-care.
Yeah, I think self-care again. Author Julia Lee, she wrote "Biting the Hand." Highly recommend if you're listening. It's such a good book, talking about the Asian American experience in America. She really unpacks this idea of self-care as caring for yourself in a world that does not. And so I am applying that understanding and that definition to what I am calling self-care. It's caring for yourself in a world that's not. So another example that is in the devotional is the Japanese women during the time of internment during World War II. Being able to see them care for themselves when the government did not. These were U.S. citizens. These were women who were honoring and paying their taxes and upright, moral women in their community. And they were treated like they had done something so very wrong, burning their family heirlooms for fear of being seen as a traitor to this new land they called home. And so for their daughters and granddaughters to rise up and demand reparations of the U.S. government, that's self-care. That is self-care.
Mm.
Self-care is taking care of yourself and one another and demanding that others have a holy imagination for the life you know you deserve to live.
I swear every time you stop talking, I just kind of want to throw down a mic and walk off the stage, even though you were the one that did it. So good. Where are you Who has been inspiring you to think in this kind of way? How did you like sort of like how did your were your eyes always open to thinking in this kind of way? Like what did something spark it? Have there been some speakers, authors? Like what has opened you up to even thinking about the scriptures in this kind of way and even to look at something like the internment camps and to see this narrative in another kind of way? Like how have you gotten there?
Well, I think, I'm not white. So being a
Yeah.
minority woman who's never had the privilege of white skin and bright eyes, and I think also, if I'm being really honest, my coming of age at 9/11 and being seen or treated as somebody who could cause hurt or harm,
Okay.
and having such a heart for goodness and wholeness and healing for not only myself and my community. So I think it just my own life experiences, plus that's my natural bent. I love history. Love I love Jesus' treatment of women in the scriptures. When you look at the gospels and how Jesus engaged women, it is radical. I could never leave the faith because of how Jesus treats women. Never, ever, ever, ever. And then I would say, as far as voices, Dr. Sarah Shaban, she is a Arab Latin professor at Seattle Pacific University. She actually contributed to the book. She's a friend of mine. Her work around women's movements, when you think about women's movements throughout human history, when you think of movements in general, you're going to find a handful of women behind the scenes who are pushing for goodness. Now that I don't mean that specifically for women's movements worldwide. Who else? I would say Gadfi, and there's so many others who are writing incredible academic books on scripture. I wouldn't say they're written for Gen Pop. They're a little headier reads, but I love the idea of combining those with women's everyday experiences, and think especially with the rise of anxiety and depression, and so many of us are in the pickup line and like, what is my life? And finding our unique contribution in a way that honors our journey, but also honors what we can contribute to society and the story as a whole.
Yeah. I love that. I went to Bible college and undergrad Bible college. Did seminary work. And this way of approaching the scriptures, I was never exposed to in all of that in a lot of ways. And so it's taken folks like you to like open up new doors for me to like, and I feel like I'm still like being exposed to like new ways of re-engaging the scriptures in more liberative ways that, especially from others' points of view. Yeah, and it's fascinating to experience that genuinely. Like, I'll keep teasing you about this probably, but through a devotional, because that feels very unexpected. And so, in some ways, genuinely, it feels like it's a redemptive resource as a
Mm.
devotional, even like in the form that you're putting it in.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. I would say, especially after writing Pray Tell. So, listeners, Pray Tell is about abuse of power at a woman's expense. And especially when we spiritualize harm against women, it's certainly not a beach read. It's a pretty heavy read. So, it is certainly a pendulum swing to write a devotional and invite you to cozy up with a cup of coffee and go before the divine and consider how the divine has engaged women in the past.
yeah. Well, so I'm kind of intrigued not only by the contents of it, like what you have been sharing a bit here, which I think hopefully for folks, like you're getting a taste of like the kind of thing that you experience in reading this. But I'm also intrigued by like the way that you put this together, where it's kind of like I have experienced books like this where it's a completely collaborative effort, right? Like there's a general editor who's maybe written one or two and then gotten a bunch of other folks to contribute the other 38 weeks. Or the one where it's like this person writes all of them. But
Yes.
instead what you did was kind of like in between those two. You wrote the majority and then you invited some friends to contribute some of them. So that's interesting to me. I discovered in that like we have some more mutual friends that didn't know that we had. Susie Gomez, who
Oh,
writes in there.
really?
Susie was down in Long Beach for a while.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Quite a while. Yeah.
Angie Hong, Kayla, Craig. So we've got some mutual folks in there, which was fun. But I'm kind of curious about this thing that is
Yeah.
like not just uniquely yours, but isn't also fully collaborative.
Yeah. I will say this was a hard sell to my publisher as well, Mike, because as you said, books are usually all collaborative with a general editor or by a single author. And I was explaining, no, like every fourth or fifth essay and entry, I want you to hear from somebody else besides me. And eventually they were on board with it. And I was so pleased with the friends that said yes to contributing. They are women that I adore. They're the women that I'm listening to. They're the women who I think are out there doing the dang thing to recalibrate what it looks like to be a woman of consequence and substance in the world today. And the majority of them are minorities as well, and liturgists and such. So I was excited that all my girlfriends said yes. And it is truly a really wide range of voices. You have, as you mentioned, Susie Gamez, she's a pastor. Angie Hong is a liturgist and a worship leader. I have Kayla Craig, who's a liturgist. I have Keisha Polonio. She is a Black trauma therapist. I have Dr. Sarah Shaban, as I mentioned before, professor of journalism. I have Patricia Taylor, who worked at Be the Bridge. So just a variety of voices. Lucretia Beria of Brownicity, talking about race education for young people today. So really, really was excited to bring this really bright view of women's issues, but also they are not writing about themselves. They're also writing about women in history. So it was an invitation for them to pick some of their favorite people throughout history who were influencing them, from the mystics to the civil rights movement to the Reformation, and then of course biblical history, and even in the last 100 years. So it was a really juicy, delightful project that I'm just so pumped they were game for. And I will say, when I think about the voices I want other men and women hearing, it's them. It's them. So excited to gas up my friends.
Yeah. Well, and I'm realizing I might not have shared with folks, like, kind of the format is kind of unique too, where you're utilizing a story from the scriptures that's centered on a woman, and you are building out of that to then also tell some historical story as well. That's not necessarily saying that those aren't necessarily historical. Maybe, maybe not. Depends on where we're coming from. But let's
Yeah.
say something that's a bit more modern history, maybe we
Yeah.
would say.
Yeah. A great example of that is I contrast conditions of care between Moses' adopted mother and his biological mother. The Midrash calls her Bithia, and Jehoshaphat. So seeing how these women had an unsaid agreement, we see them in different scenes in scripture. So we never think of them as a team, but they had conditions of care for this young man to grow up in safety. And then I kind of contrast that with the women of the Iroquois, the oldest democracy on the earth, where it's a matriarchy-led tribe, and you see low levels of sexual violence. You see high levels of women in leadership, obviously, but less war and all of these things that happen when we allow women to have a voice in crafting conditions of care, not only for our families, but communities and societies at
Oh
large.
my gosh. Yeah, it's so brilliant in how you weave those together. And then I noticed also that it's like, it seemed that you're quoting maybe only or at least majority female scholars and writers as you are quoting folks in it. I don't know. I thought that it
That was
was
hard, man. That was super hard to do. But
okay.
yes,
Yeah,
it was
that's
the
what I'm curious
attempt.
about. Tell me about
Super hard.
why that was hard.
It's hard because there is not the access on. And I'm so glad you asked me this, because, when you think about research and you're on all of the different academic journals and all of the places that you would look for research from the female gaze, it's harder to access, it's harder to find. And I'm really grateful. Kat Armis is a genius at this, the author
Okay.
and speaker, Kat Armis, and theologian. She is brilliant at finding female voices to highlight. So I've really looked up a lot of the women she's referenced and gone and researched them for myself. Shannon K. Evans as well. She works for the Catholic Reporter, wrote Rewilding Motherhood and also Prayers for My Feminist Daughter. So there's just some great women out there who are also doing the digging, but it took a minute to unearth the kind of quotes and the research and the historians I wanted to feature, but I was successful. Also, I would say, just looking at various Jewish archives as well, and not only looking at it from a specific modern Christian lens, was really, really, really helpful. Even looking at modern Jewish women and modern Jewish stories that I feature in it as well.
Yeah. Well, I appreciated it. I don't know, like, it definitely feels like are you targeting women to read it? primarily as your primary audience?
Yeah, I would say this is my first book that I feel like is solely like so hyper focused on just women, whereas Pray Tell was very much written for men
Yes.
to read because the problem of, sexual violence is at their hands. However, this one, I feel like it's so valuable for men to learn from women. I think, as you said, you made a joke that I only read male authors, but you know how often we love to hear if there is any sort of professional development book going to be in the self-help section if it's by a woman. If it's going to be by a man, it's going to be in a business
Right.
section. And so I hope that I can cross some boundaries here because it's women who literally have changed our world. We all stand on their shoulders, men, women, and children, because of their contribution.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was going to say was I felt like it might be written towards a female-oriented audience, but I didn't feel excluded in reading it in a way that felt
Mm.
like really actually helpful and beneficial for me. And one of the things that I thought in going through it was like, gosh, how many times have women had to like sort of figure out how to read through a book that's like a guy writing for a primary male audience, and even if they're not
Yeah.
explicitly saying that, and that you're figuring out like what to do with that in order to like and to recognize like there's so much for me to glean here,
Yeah.
and there might be a couple of little things where I'm like, oh well, that's not necessarily me, but it's really easy to figure out like what do I do with that. And I wouldn't be there aren't a lot of places where I'm finding all of these voices in this kind of a way, so it felt like really important for
Yeah.
me to be able to engage in that, so I appreciated
Mm.
that.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
I was curious also then at a sort of like larger level, was there any story from the scriptures that like surprised you in a way that you weren't like expecting as you engaged in this?
Oh man, I had so much fun. The research portion of this book was just so good and delicious in every way possible. A few stories that surprised me that I was like, wow, I really haven't done enough digging was the wailing women in the Old Testament.
Hmm.
When Israel would mourn a national tragedy, they would bring in the wailing women to lead the nation to a place of healing. It was this embodied mourning of the people. And there's an invitation for all daughters of Israel to rise up and lead together. So in a time and space and place where women had almost zero agency, they're tapped in the hardest moments. They're tapped when everything has gone to crap and they can't see a way forward. It's the women who are brought in to lead the way out of the mess. Now, I contrast that with Cameroonian women who, in the middle of conflict, when the prime minister was visiting their town, as soon as he stepped off the plane, there was women wailing at the top of their lungs for hours, demanding help and demanding care as their families and children were being murdered due to strife in the area. So this idea that wailing has a place, the idea that wailing is a path to healing, not just stuffing it down, not just chin up buttercup, but it was women who would lead the way in the middle of national tragedy. I think that is just remarkable to look at. It isn't this like, hey, how are we going to clean up? It was the only time they were tapped to lead, quite frankly, was in times of tragedy.
Yeah, that's so good. I can't help but as you like keep telling these things to keep thinking about like for folks that are listening that are like pastoring churches, like this feels like such a no-brainer sermon series to me to like take some of
Ooh,
this content,
come on. Your words, not mine. Wow. I love that. I will run with this idea.
right?
I love it.
Well, and are you because for folks that do lead churches, do you guest preach? Do you show up places and preach?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah. I before taking my current role, I was about 30 times a year. And now I'm like, man, we'll
occasionally.
take the ones I really want to do. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Well, I mean, I just want to throw out there for folks that they should be, I'll make sure that we get whatever links we need to in the show notes for folks to find you. But like, I've never heard you preach, but I feel like you can sit with somebody and very quickly tell if you've been preaching long enough, you can very quickly tell how they're going to show up as a preacher. And it can very quickly tell
100%.
like the way that you would show up as a preacher would be such a gift to so many communities, the way that both you would approach the text and the way that you would like what you're going to pull out of that and the way that you're going to show up in that community. Like, gosh, it just feels like there's so much that you have to offer folks that are leading churches that I hope that like there's space for you in that.
Oh, I received that. I received that. I am I just go back to your last question. When we dig in to some of these short 2, 3, 4 verse stories of women in the Old and New Testament, we are sitting on such a gold mine of understanding resilience and understanding how we can process today's events and how we can move through today's world in a way that women have gone before us and done so very well. And it was so imperfect, but it was so good. It was so good.
I love that. Well, let me ask you this before we close out and make sure we get all your information out there for folks. So the Women We've Been Waiting For is the book. I think that we said it earlier, but I want to make sure that we said it again, because you have to mention it like 4.5 times or something, right?
Well,
I don't know. I'm making up a
the
stat.
women we've been waiting for. The women we've been waiting for.
What's your hope that, like, what would come out of this?
If I'm being really honest, I wrote the kind of devotional I wanted to read because, as you said at the start of our time, they're very flowery, they're very light, and I wanted to just peel back the layers of what somebody could explore and meditate and think on and engage in 10, 12 minutes a day in a way that would help them see themselves differently, see their communities differently, and not count themselves out from how they can contribute to the church and community at large in this time. Self-care can lead to communal flourishing, I'm convinced. And that's my hope. That's my hope, that when we understand self-care and when we embrace our resilience rather than being resentful of how hard life is, that would lead to communal flourishing.
I love that. I'm so grateful for you. Where can folks find you? How can they be paying attention to what you're doing?
Yeah, everything book and travel and speaking related is at TiffanyBluhm.com. And then for the everyday, I hang out on Instagram at Tiffany Bluhm.
All right. And Bloom is Bluhm, so that you all...
Jewish spelling.
Oh, is it really?
Jewish spelling.
Look at you.
It's in everything.
But Tiffany, genuinely, what a gift. So fun to get to talk with you. This book is a gift. I'm hopeful that it's on like the bedside table of homes all over the place. And yeah, I'm really grateful for you. Thanks for showing up today.
Thanks for having me.